Dr. Jones, thank you so much for joining us today and taking the time out of your busy day from your patients.
Yeah, no, thank you for having me. I am starting to really enjoy the outlet that you're giving me here to share this stuff. So yeah, peptides are awesome. I know that's on today's agenda.
Yeah, it is literally my favorite subject. But for a lot of people on GLP-1 medications, peptides are a foreign land. Other than GLP-1s, glucagon-like peptides, they've never really been exposed to peptides. Can you explain to people maybe what they are and how they might help a GLP-1 journey?
Totally. So, on a literal sense, peptides are short chains of amino acids. Amino acids are the building blocks of proteins, and our bodies, our organs, and our tissues are made up of proteins. And so, when you break down a protein, you're breaking it down into hundreds of amino acids. And so, in between the individual amino acid itself and the large protein molecule, you have peptides, which are like a string, like a linear chain. Although if you look at it in a microscope, you have these amino acids that are connected with these bonds, and they're twisted, and they have this three-dimensional configuration. And each unique three-dimensional configuration or shape is what gives it its function, because somehow which is just amazing, by the way, the human body's so sensitive to that. You can have literally the same peptides, but one is bent a different way. It's like literally in three-dimensional space. And when it hits the cell, it causes a completely different thing to happen. And so I love the way Dr. Seeds explains it. He calls peptide therapy cellular communication. And that really resonates with me, because it is how your cells communicate to other cells to orchestrate certain pathways of physiology of health. For example, because one of the more popular peptides are growth hormone peptides, and your body's natural process to release growth hormone isn't just dump the growth hormone out. No, the growth hormone itself is made and stored in the pituitary gland, this small little peanut-sized gland near the frontal side of your brain. And you have this part in the back called the hypothalamus, which is kind of like this base, more big regulatory center, which kind of commands a lot of basic processes your body does. And so it releases peptides, and then peptides float in the vessels of the brain, and they make it to the pituitary gland, and then they target the gland. And when the gland receives that message, then the process of dumping growth hormone out into the bloodstream. So it's really orchestrated. And so a lot of people have more familiarity with hormones. And so I always like to use hormone therapy as kind of a real kind of base to kind of sink your understanding of peptides to. A little bit different, but really close enough. Your body has these glands. They release the hormones. The hormones float around, and same thing, target tissues. In fact, I did a whole podcast with one of my mentors about really what is the difference between a peptide and a hormone and a drug. And we really talked about that for a while. It was a really awesome episode. But essentially, there wasn't a clear answer even from him. And I consider him like the functional wizard. There is not a clear understanding and difference, because you'll see those words used interchangeably: peptide hormones, even when you read books of physiology, and they use those words kind of interchangeably. So it's really interesting. Peptides tend to degrade really quickly, though. So it's almost like they hit a target cell and they cause this process to turn on. And it's not like that. Once the peptide degrades, though, that process can go on for however long that process goes on, which is interesting. But nonetheless, yeah, peptides have some subtle differences, but similar enough to kind of how hormones function. They're driving, in summary, they drive, they optimize, I think is a better way to say. It should be used this way. They should be used as ways to optimize certain parts of your physiology. I like that way to kind of summarize how they should be used.
That's actually a great explanation. So let's get into some of the different areas that peptides can help. Because I know we have peptides that aid in weight loss, peptides that aid in muscle hypertrophy or retaining your muscle loss, even women's sexual health and libido. There's reparative peptides that help your body if you get into injury or have inflammation. And there's peptides that have a lot to do with sleep, and sleep's so important to lipolysis and like losing fat in general. Could you maybe think of explain how a peptide could be added to a GLP-1 medication specifically for weight loss, for losing
Yeah.
fat?
Yeah, I think that's what everybody wants, right? That's the juicy area. I think the fat loss and then probably muscle building is number two. And then, if we have time, we can get into the other stuff. So other categories. So when it comes to fat loss, weight loss, I like to put these peptides into two categories. So I have category one, category two, and you'll understand here in a bit why I separate them. So category one is your appetite suppressing peptides. So the main players are the GLP-1s, the Semaglutide, the Tirzepatide, the Retatrutide now. And then you have this other one that's kind of in its own category, but it's in the category one, which is Testofensine. And so, Testofensine, by the way, really isn't a peptide. It is a medication, but it gets really used in the peptide and anti-aging space. And so sometimes people accidentally call it a peptide, but Testofensine, very briefly, was being researched for Alzheimer's, and then they noticed, there's some really cool effects in fat loss here, and so Testofensine has really similar effects to GLP-1 medications. Now, I've seen people kind of say, it's better, or, they take this one study on Testofensine, which looked really good. I can tell you, in my opinion, it's the second best player. A GLP-1 is always going to be your best for that food chatter suppression. But Testofensine, if we didn't have GLP-1s, would be the most powerful player. And so I call these category one because while there's so many amazing properties to category two, which we're just about to get into next, fat mobilization being the main piece of it. Unfortunately, I see a lot of companies, selling these peptides to people, getting their hopes up, and then a lot of people spending this money and not getting results. And the reason being is because you can mobilize your fat and do all these things to help support fat loss. But at the end of the day, if you're still eating like shit, if you're still in a caloric surplus, you're not going to lose weight, And so it really is a disservice to these people to sell them these peptides without their understanding of that. So I always like to separate them that way. But if you're on a GLP-1, which a lot of your listeners and my listeners are, all right, we're doing the right things. Even if you're not following Dr. Jones's flow protocol and going to the nth degree, at least you're eating less of the same crap. Okay, you're losing weight. So the prerequisite is I'm already losing weight. I think that's probably the easiest sort of like, okay, I'm not throwing my money down the drain if I add this peptide because I'm already losing a weight. The caveat is don't take these first to start your weight loss journey. That's kind of like probably the best way to think of it to protect yourself. So now we get into category two. Category two is the main component is fat mobilization. And that term understandably confuses people. And they ask like, what does that even mean? So fat mobilization is sort of the prerequisite to actually burning and utilizing the fat. So when your body wants to utilize fat for energy, it's got to mobilize it first. It's got to access it. It's got to put it through multiple pathways to get it from one version of itself to a different version where it can be utilized, right? And so fat mobilization is just referring to it's like an umbrella term to refer to all those different things that have to do with getting the fat from your body where it's in the storage form into the usable form. And so what's interesting, though, is that you hear this concept going back to the calories in versus calories out. If you're in a deficit, your body has to get the energy, okay? So it's going to get the energy one way or another. And if you're not fat, and so fat adapted is a term that refers to what we're talking about. When you're fat adapted, or the other term, metabolically flexible, that's what we're talking about. We're saying that your ability to mobilize fat is good. It's better. It's excellent. It's whatever you want to call it. Your body can do this really effectively. It can grab the fat and utilize it when it needs to. And so one of the problems with insulin resistance is that your body's fatty mobilization abilities dramatically decrease. By definition, because when you're insulin resistant, you have chronically elevated insulin levels, and that's a constant signal to grow, store. So if you have this powerful signal from insulin telling you to grow tissues and to store, you're not mobilizing, right? It's difficult, it's challenging. So when you put your body into this caloric deficit while being very insulin resistant or even partially, now you're really stressing the body out. because you're forcing it to survive, which it has to and it will. But if it can't rely on the ability to burn fat because its fatty mobilization ability is low, it's not fat adapted, it's not metabolically flexible. Now your body has to rely on cortisol and stress hormones and other mechanisms to get the job done. And that, in my opinion, is one of the reasons why some people plateau really quickly, why some people go into that starvation mode. And I'm glad that we did this order because now I'm bringing it back so people watching today will have a good understanding that because why do some people go into starvation mode so fast and other people can just starve themselves and lose 100 pounds and their metabolism seems to never slow down. There's a lot of unknowns there, but I've seen it and I've wondered and asked that question myself. And I think insulin resistance plays a huge role because the individual who is insulin resistant, you're stressing your body out by putting itself in this caloric deficit, and so it's got to do whatever it can, which is more stressful. Cortisol, I think, plays a big role here, and eventually your body says, I can't deal with this. Let me just crank the metabolism down sooner, because if it didn't do that, it's in that stressful environment where it needs the fat for energy, but it can't get it, right? And so I think of these peptides, and we'll talk about the specific ones here in a second, but I think of these peptides as the optimizers. As amazing as GLP-1 is, we just talked about it. You're still insulin resistant. You're still struggling to mobilize fat. And so you can add these peptides to increase fat adaptation, to increase metabolic flexibility. And that kind of bridges the gap. It's like the last big piece to what the GLP-1s aren't doing, which, by the way, Tirzepatide does do a little bit of metabolic flexibility, which we'll probably save that for another podcast. So Tirzepatide does do a little bit of this, which I think is one of the main reasons why Tirzepatide is so much better than Semaglutide, because Semaglutide doesn't do the fat mobilization. But I still see that even with Tirzepatide having some fat mobilization, the addition of one of these peptides really enhances that result, which the net effect of that means you don't plateau as fast. The weight loss is coming from more fat and less muscle mass. And that's the end all be all of what we're trying to do as we lose weight is we got to protect our muscle mass and we got to lose more fat relative to the total amount of weight we're losing.
No, I like that. And when I started using peptides, I noticed that difference. It was just like that. Everybody's always searching for that supplement, right? What supplement can I buy? I'm sure you get that 1,000,000,000 times. What supplement can I buy? And I really think for a lot of people, it would be peptides. Like that would be the best bang for your buck and has more efficacy than a lot of these, berberine and all these other stuff, which, has some data, but not too much. But so getting into adding to a GLP-1, what particular peptide would you want to add for fat loss? What would be the one that you would add to complement GLP-1 to help those conditions that you're talking about?
Totally. So you have in the category of category 2, we kind of have 2 subcategories. You have your growth hormone secretagogues, which are the ones that would actually stimulate the release of growth hormone, like the example we mentioned earlier. And then you have this one outlier called AOD 9604. That is my favorite peptide. So let's start there. AOD 9604 is not growth hormone, and it's not stimulating growth hormone, but it itself is actually a fragment of the human growth hormone molecule, which is really interesting. So microscopically, growth hormone is actually a really large molecule in a hormone and molecule space, a hormone and peptide space. So growth hormone is very large, and it causes on its own growth hormone. If you took it exogenously, like actually injected real growth hormone, or if you took one of these growth hormone secreting peptides, the net effect of more growth hormone is kind of a nice, and this is why they've always called growth hormone the fountain of youth. You get the fat mobilization, you get muscle, increased protein synthesis, which can be utilized to either help you build muscle or prevent the loss. You get immune system improvement, you get cognitive function improvement, you get musculoskeletal injury healing and repair. So there's a lot of benefits of growth hormone, but I still prefer AOD as the starting peptide because it's focused solely on just the fat loss phase, on the fat loss effect. So, because that's what it is, it's a fragment. So they took that large molecule, separated it, just the portion of it that does the fat mobilization, and that's what you're getting. while there's no clinical data that I've seen comparing head-to-head AOD versus growth hormone secretagogue or even growth hormones fatty mobilization effect, this is just Dr. Jones's observation. I just noticed better results on people in that particular pathway of AOD's ability to mobilize body fat, which to me, even though all those other things that growth hormone does is really awesome, and you totally can still use those, if you ask me what's the best one, and that's what what we do, my clinicians are on the same page. We like to pair the GLP-1 with the AOD as the starter. If you have the financials to be able to stack another growth hormone peptide, cool, especially if your goal is muscle mass, which all of us should be muscle mass. But let's say you have a higher inclination towards muscle mass, then you can stack a growth hormone peptide too. But AOD specifically, I think of it as the supercharged, concentrated fat mobilizing peptide to do what we wanted to accomplish, which we just talked about earlier.
And what does AOD stand for?
Anti-obesity drug. It's a name that I don't really know where it got that name from. And I think it was actually interesting because it was actually on the FDA safe peptide list, which I think is fascinating because if you follow the FDA regulations of peptides, it all of a sudden went from the safe list to the concerning dangerous list when all these peptides got quote unquote banned, which is also really, really controversial because they never really got banned. They just got added to this category 2 list, which essentially told the world, hey, we don't know if these are safe. I'm just going to leave it at that.
The DDC list, the demonstrably difficult, the compounding list.
Yep.
But wasn't it just removed and added back to formulary?
Yep. So just recently, AOD, there's 4 or 5 of them: AOD, CJC, 1295, Ipamorelin, I think C-Link, BPC 157. There's about 4 or 5 of them that just got okayed, and so a lot of compounding pharmacies now are able to provide them. And which is great. It's a nice movement in the right direction. I've heard rumblings that maybe CJC or BPC might become FDA approved. I just heard that from a compounding pharmacist. Who knows the validity of that statement? I don't know. But anyway, we have access to them, and I absolutely think they're an integral piece to everybody's journey. So
before we move into other compounds, I just want to ask you really clearly, how are the peptides administered? Is it subcutaneous? Are you doing troches? And are all of these peptides that we're going to talk about today something that you and your practitioners prescribe?
Yes. And then I'd love to talk about the difference between research and 503A too as well, if you want to get into that.
Definitely.
So there's a lot of different administrative routes. Just generally speaking, peptides, the most common route is injection, subcutaneous injection. So it's a little baby insulin needle. But they can be inhaled. They can, they could be breathed intranasally. They could be rubbed as a cream. They can be orally ingested. They can be in a troche, which is commonly used for hormone administration and other medication administration. You pop the troche in between your teeth and your gums, and it absorbs through the buccal mucosa because there's actually a lot of circulation there. So there's many routes of potential administration. But then when you actually get into the world of peptides, certain peptides are just known to be best delivered in certain routes, most of them being subcutaneous injection. I think with AOD in particular, we happen to have secured a really awesome troche version because I had a lot of compounding pharmacies over the last couple of years, try our troches, but it wasn't until recently that I've been comfortable with troches. It's still a higher dose to kind of make up for the fact that you're still not absorbing as much as you would through the injection. But I think a lot of people appreciate not having to do the injection every day, although it's still an easy injection when you're really in the optimization space. I think a lot of people are like, I don't mind a little baby needle every day. Some people do. It's hard enough to get some people to even do the weekly injection. So yeah, the troche is kind of nice for the AOD.
And then you touched on already, before we could talk about the other ones, could you explain the difference? Because people may or may not know that you can buy a lot of these peptides online from some online broker, send them money that they say not for human consumption, research grade only, as opposed to what you provide at your clinic for these peptides.
Yeah. And, I always tell people I like to throw Dr. Andrew Huberman's name out there because if you guys don't know who he is, he's a wealth of knowledge, and he really is just trying to put out as much free research-backed information, and that's like one of the biggest thing he prides himself in is supplying research-backed information. He's really conservative, and even he says it multiple times recently. In the world of peptides, he calls them black market. Same thing, research peptides. So let's start there. So you can literally go online. And there's so many companies out there. God knows how many. There's probably hundreds or thousands of them. And you could just buy whatever the hell you want, which is crazy to me that you can even buy the GLP-1s. The thing about the peptides is it's not that they're not dangerous, but peptides, what separates them from pharmaceuticals is that they do have this component or I guess you can say aspect about them that the potential for overdose or toxicity is much different than pharmaceuticals. The threshold for them to become concerning, you could accidentally inject, like for BPC 157, significantly, 100 times over the clinical dose and maybe get a little nauseous. Versus you did that with a drug, you wouldn't be alive. And so that's really fascinating with peptides, is that you have this almost, I would say, this is a controversial opinion, almost pharmaceutically potent, comparable therapy, peptides, without the risks. And I think a lot of people would say that's because they are naturally occurring in the body, and you're just kind of replacing the signal. And so, anyways, there's that aspect of it. But going back to the research companies, you have two concerns. Number one, they can say whatever the hell they want. There's no regulatory body or agency governing anything they say. So, I have people that say, well, Dr. Jones, here's their certificate of analysis. And I'm like, literally some dude can just print that and that's what they give you. There's no governing body whatsoever validating that at all. And I know that's like, a 100%. And so, number one, on a lighter note, let's just say I'm not even worried about contaminants and hurting myself. Are you actually getting efficacious peptides? Which I think in most cases you're not. That's part of why they can sell them for so dang cheap. But then on the other case, you have potential for real harm. And I don't think this is definitely not a fear-mongering statement that I'm saying you will get screwed up when you do that. Obviously, they're businesses, and if they were hurting a bunch of people, they probably wouldn't be in business. And so not saying that like a lot of that's happening, especially from some of these bigger ones. But it's just you're injecting these in your body. And so, user beware and understand that there is no regulatory body over it. And God forbid you become the first one that does have a bad batch, So you have that. But more importantly, I think what's the more likely concerning thing is you're just getting, very low quality, if any quality, peptides from them. And Dr. Huberman talked about that a lot with not just him, but many peptide experts on his show have all attested to the same thing. And so that's one category of peptides. So then the other category is getting them from a licensed healthcare practitioner, like the ones in our clinic. We are getting them from what we call a 503A or B, which are designations from the FDA. So these are compounding pharmacies. These are the same compounding pharmacies that are making your GLP-1s. Your beloved GLP-1s are also making these peptides. And while they're not 100% solely regulated by the FDA, in fact, they're not. Their main, I guess you would say, jurisdiction falls under the state compounding pharmacies, but the FDA is still heavily involved in regulatory control. And these facilities are commonly investigated by these regulatory bodies like the FDA and the state compounding pharmacies, and the standards are insanely high. And like anything, right, there's always going to be some bad actors in the space, and that is unfortunate. And so there is a little bit of that potential aspect, but the risk aspect, like the likelihood of that happening from a peptide that comes from a practitioner who's prescribing it from these facilities, I think is much lower, if any, compared to what's happening from the research companies, which I wish I can share this video with you. I was sworn into secrecy, but I got my hands on a video from a really good friend of mine who said, if you release this, I will free. I got to see firsthand the facility of one of the big research peptide companies. I won't even say their name because I will upset a lot of people. But comparing that to when you walk into a facility from a compounding pharmacy, I mean, this facility in question was literally something out of a garage compared to, and again, I can't attest every single research company. And maybe they'll have their arguments to why they're still good, even though it looks like a joke. It's just a completely different ballpark.
So going into the muscle preservation, muscle loss dominates the conversation. A lot of the negative press that you hear about GLP-1s is like, oh, you're just going to melt away. It's great that you're losing all the weight, but you're going to be a bag of bones at the end of this, a bag of fat and bones. Can you talk about maybe some of the peptides that would help facilitate muscle retention or gaining or slowing, like the amount that you might risk losing as a part of your weight loss journey?
Absolutely. And like we said, all these topics coming up, just a muscle building podcast will be great. Yeah. I want to spend a couple minutes just touching on that before we even get into peptides, because it's so important to me that people, before they invest money, have the potential for getting the best results. And because unfortunately, peptides are not covered by insurance, and they're a huge investment for people. Sometimes they're just not even an option for other people too as well. People that are going the distance to make this work, it's really important to me that they maximize the results. We don't even take some patients who are just unwilling to do some of their part. So real quickly, to briefly summarize, GLP-1s do not cause muscle mass loss. Okay. In fact, I don't know if you saw this clip from Peter Attia that was getting thrown out there by so many people, a lot of supplement companies, the Unimate, and which, by the way, I love that product. We could talk about that another time. I just don't like the company. I don't like the model, but I love the product, the Unimate and the Balance. A lot of these supplement companies were using this clip that came from Peter Attia, where he was like, a lot of my patients are losing a ton of muscle mass. And it was just like this total clip where you have no context. You have no idea. I've never found the episode where it came from, which was interesting, but I would bet a lot of money that Dr. Peter Attia would not sit here and tell you GLP-1s cause muscle mass loss. There's just no way, shape, or form. And if anybody can get him to tell me that or show me something where he would say that, I would love to get on a podcast with him and pick his brain on that, because I have so much respect for him. And I highly, highly doubt he thinks that way. It's one thing for him to say, yeah, I have a lot of patients on it and they're losing muscle mass. It's quite a different thing to say GLP-1s cause muscle mass loss. So what causes muscle mass loss? And this is the same for starvation mode, which we talked about earlier. This is the same, in my opinion, for hair loss. And a lot of these issues is massive caloric restriction. Now, in the case of muscle mass loss, it's that quick and massive caloric restriction over time. It's also most paired with not doing enough hypertrophy style resistance training. And the third thing is not consuming enough protein. If you have your protein dialed in, if you have your training dialed in, and if you are not starving, if those three things are into play, there's a few other things like cortisol and stress and sleep. Of course, we can get really nuanced, but those three things, if those three things are dialed in on your GLP-1 journey, the majority of people will not be withering away and like you said, shriveling up to a bag of bones. Because in fact, GLP-1s, in my opinion, optimize muscular growth, because you will build muscle mass. You will be in a better environment to build muscle mass, or at least maintain it during a weight loss journey, when you're more insulin sensitive, when your inflammation is reduced, which is exactly what GLP-1s do. It's just that signal of suppressing the appetite, which is paired with people's lack of knowledge how to approach the calories and the energy and the protein. That combo together is what creates the bag of bones scenario. So I just want to be clear. Those three things are dialed in. Okay, now, how do we optimize this? How do we build more muscle mass? Even then, before growth hormone peptides, I would still encourage someone to look at their testosterone levels, because testosterone therapy, in my opinion, is more important before you start throwing growth hormone peptides. If you have suboptimal or low testosterone, number one, it's way cheaper. The return on investment from testosterone therapy is significantly cheaper. And we're not just talking the muscle benefit, but you get the entire quality of life, which is amazing. You'll feel better. You'll be more motivated. You'll be more encouraged and more motivated to do all the right things. Okay, great. Let's optimize testosterone. Now we can play with peptides. For women too. Absolutely. I'm glad you brought that up, because I know there's some maybe just not understanding that women need testosterone therapy freaking just as much as men. And I mean, basically every single symptom that a man can get, except obviously erectile dysfunction, is totally on the table for women. And in addition to the other hormone deficiencies too, as well, that they get with menopause, and that's a whole other conversation. But yes, for women, testosterone therapy, if they need it, which we'll table the whole in-depth hormone thing for another podcast, but basically having the symptoms of suboptimal testosterone and then verifying that clinically with the lower level would be enough for most practitioners to say, hey, let's have a discussion about optimizing your testosterone levels. So assuming that's dialed in, that's not a huge issue. Now we can play with peptides to really optimize. And this is the first things that come to mind are the growth hormone peptides. And so we talked a little bit about them: Semorelin, Tesamorelin, and then you have CJC 1295 / Ipamorelin, which is really two different peptides, but they're always almost always compounded together because they have this really powerful synergistic effect. So let's start with the ones that are FDA approved that I think more people are aware of: Semorelin and Tesamorelin. So Semorelin is actually FDA approved specifically for growth hormone deficiency syndromes in both children and adults. So you can get that covered by insurance, actually, and that's a pretty rare issue to have true clinical grade growth hormone level deficiency. You would see very, prevalent physical manifestations that would be apparent if you had these issues. And so growth hormone deficiency, you can use Semorelin. And Semorelin is this growth hormone releasing hormone that we talked about earlier, that when you take it, triggers the pituitary to dump its own growth hormone. So Semorelin is actually the weakest out of the ones we've talked about. Tesamorelin, much more expensive. That's the holy grail. That's the big kahuna. Tesamorelin is the best. It's got the strongest release of growth hormone. This one is actually FDA approved for HIV patients, specifically a medical condition known as lipodystrophy, which is just a lot of visceral fat, which visceral fat is just, our understanding now is unraveling in front of us as we speak. And we know how detrimental visceral fat is to your health. And I guess, and I'm not familiar with the HIV medications, but the concoction of medications they have to put HIV patients in leads to a lot of visceral fat, lipodystrophy. And so Tesamorelin is FDA approved for these individuals to help them with that visceral fat. So in the holistic and anti-aging space, a lot of people call Tesamorelin the holy grail for burning belly fat, which is actually true because that's literally what it was designed for, to burn belly fat from these patients. And so, but it could also be used for muscle building. So we're talking about muscle building right now. All these growth hormone peptides can be used just as much for somebody who wants to maximally build muscle mass, or if they just want to protect the muscle mass during their fat loss journey. What would change would be the amount of calories you're taking in, probably the amount of training to a certain extent, and then the amount of protein. But ultimately, it's gonna drive an increased protein synthesis, which is the conversion of the protein and the nitrogen down the pathways of muscle building and muscle protection. So Tesamorelin is phenomenal for both that, muscle building and burning belly fat. But my favorite, actually, because it's more cost effective, because Tesamorelin is really pricey. Although the price has come down a lot, actually, it's still up there. CJC 1295 and Ipamorelin. The combo of these two peptides blows Semorelin out of the water. And you're going to get them for about the same cost for most compounding pharmacies, especially from us. It's about the same cost. So we almost always recommend CJC and the Ipamorelin combo. And you get a really good, strong pulse when you have the ratio correct. That's the other thing. A lot of these research companies, I've seen some weird combos in the ratio of these two peptides. When you get the ratio right, the pulse of growth hormone is pretty good, and up to really good, actually. And it just it has to be dosed correctly, the way that you inject it. And so yeah, those are the three, I guess four, you would say, that come to mind for muscle building peptides. We're absolutely going to get you a custom link that you can give people. In the meantime, correct, and I'm glad you brought that up for clarity's sake. So there are some people in this space that think prescribing real growth hormone has its merit, I guess you could say. I'm not one of them. I'm not convinced that it's so we don't prescribe growth hormone. Um, maybe it is, and maybe we just haven't learned and got comfortable enough with it. I've just seen, what concerns me about actual growth hormone use, is we see anecdotal evidence of even insulin resistance developing late stage with chronic exogenous real growth hormone use. So that alone, to me, I'm like, oh my God, anything that can lead towards insulin resistance is literally the antithesis of what we're trying to do here. It's the opposite, like stay away from insulin resistance. So that alone, and then also some other weird things like carpal tunnel, some thyroid issues. I don't know. Now that we have these growth hormone peptides, it doesn't even make sense to try to figure out how to work with growth hormone. For us, I haven't seen any use case that we like, oh man, the growth hormone peptides aren't enough. No, the growth hormone peptides are great. And so yes, it's the growth hormone peptides. You're injecting a peptide, not growth hormone, but that peptide is triggering your pituitary gland to release its own growth hormone, which is what your pituitary gland is already doing on its own. You are doing this as you speak. You would never not be doing this. But as we age, and this is how you would argue for the use of peptides in general, would be as we age, the peptide signaling innately in the body decreases. It's the same argument for hormone therapy. You give somebody hormones because their own innate production of the hormones decreases. That's a whole nother why that's happening. I mean, there's just a ton of endocrine disrupting chemicals that are plaguing us, and food that we eat, the air that we breathe, there's just goes on and on and on. So because of that, humans are being subjected to very unnatural states. And so all we're trying to do is optimize these pathways of physiology that I think innately we used to not have a problem with. And now we're dealing with it because of society's combination of factors that we're having to endure.
Before we get into the next question I have about peptides, I wanted to just ask you, if in your clinic, you have people come in generally on a GLP-1 medications. How does your clinic, because a lot of people may not know that you can stack a lot of these peptides, that you can
Yeah.
use them in combination on top of each other, and having somebody to be able to guide you and try out certain types of stacks. How do you go about the process of stacking different peptides? And what would be, for just a general person, just, a Jane Doe, the optimal, your perfect world stack? If money was not an
Yeah.
issue.
Yeah, totally. The super stack. So before we get to the super stack, in a clinical sense, it's comfort from the prescribers knowing that, because there's no data on this, right? Peptides are so fascinating that it's one of the only examples I know of where we have such widespread usage with a lack of so much human data. And I know that could scare, and that will prevent some people, understandably so, like, oh, there's no human data, I'm not touching it. Fair enough. You would be wise to have that thought process in your head. No human data, I'm going to wait. It's totally rational and logical, and probably do you more good than harm in most cases. So understandable. But yeah, we don't have the human data. And so I think that's why the introduction and usage of peptides took a lot of time. And honestly, I think Dr. Seeds and a few compounding pharmacies that come to mind had a lot to do with the explosion. And because one doctor's like, man, I really want to do this. The science makes sense, but I'm scared because I don't want to hurt people or get in trouble. And then they see more doctors doing it, and it's just like a snowball effect. And that's kind of how this is. And so, yeah, I mean, it's just a comfort level straight up from the prescribers, knowing that peptides are not like drugs. In the sense, there's many differences, but the difference in particular we're talking about is you can't just willy-nilly throw different prescriptions to patients, because we know these drugs have potentially lethal interactions. But with peptides, it's kind of like you can do that in most cases, and it's relatively pretty safe. And so it's just a comfort level of knowing that you can, most peptides can be stacked with very little concern. Very little. I'm oversimplifying, but in a general sense, comparatively much safer and easier. So that's to address that part of your question. And then the stack, the holy grail stack. Honestly, Tirzepatide and AOD, for most people, if that's all you did, that would be freaking amazing. because you get the GLP-1 category 1, like we talked about. You get the fat mobilization enhancement from the category 2. And then everything would be situational and nuanced, because this is where the individual aspect comes in. And we haven't even talked about this, but we start every patient off in that level of a program, which I call my Flow Warrior coaching level. And we also sell this panel individual too, as well, even if you don't do my coaching, because some people they're not getting this blood work. We start with a very comprehensive blood panel that has many pieces of it. Because thyroid can be a roadblock, inflammation can be a roadblock, cortisol can be a roadblock, insulin resistance is a friggin' roadblock. And so the blood panel has your basics, your CBC, make sure your cells, your CMP, those are all standard. You're getting those from your doctor, but what you're not getting is everything else. You're going to get your TSH for thyroid, but you're not getting a functional thyroid panel. So we're looking at TSH, free T3, free T4, reverse T3. I know we don't have time to get into all those, unfortunately, but it's a very comprehensive and functional thyroid panel. We're checking a fasted insulin and C-peptide. That's how we can see how insulin resistant an individual is. Not that I need to do that. Honestly, we added that more for the patients because it's an objective test for them to confirm. It's really easy to diagnose insulin resistance with just a questionnaire about some certain metrics about the body. But that's really cool because we can have that objective test. And then we have inflammation panels like CRP and ESR, which again, it's like throwing an umbrella out there to see potentially how inflamed an individual is, although you can still be inflamed and not have those markers be high. And so this panel allows us to really fine tune potential roadblocks for individuals in addition to the consultation and discussion with them. So we can tailor individual aspects that would be really, really important. So for example, Tirzepatide and AOD would be the best stack, I think, for most people in a general sense. Now, am I talking to an autoimmune patient? Okay, because that's a huge, huge category. Autoimmune patients have a huge roadblock to weight loss because in addition to their insulin resistance, they're heavily inflamed because they got this erratic immune system targeting tissues for destruction, and autoimmunity is a whole other thing. But we love low dose naltrexone. Low dose naltrexone is kind of like microdosing GLP-1s. They just, for whatever reason, whoever started using it came up with this kind of LDN, low dose naltrexone. Naltrexone is a drug that's FDA approved for its own unique situations, recovering alcohol addicts, opiate addicts, which is kind of random. Like that's what it does. But microdosing it, like fractions of the dose, has this whole other use case of massively calming down the immune system, which is what you want in this erratic, overactive immune system scenario we call autoimmunity. But then it also massively reduces inflammation. So just, again, not a peptide, but still something we bring up in this space. That's a tailored tool for individuals who need it. So we have things like low dose naltrexone. We have BPC 157, which is another powerful anti-inflammatory peptide for individuals who have that particular roadblock to them. So there's a lot of other scenarios where we can kind of modify the best stack. I would say for the autoimmune patient, it would be the Tirzepatide, the AOD, the LDN, and the BPC. And then we can go on and on in different use cases. But generally, to bring it back, for most people, AOD Tirzepatide would be phenomenal. And then we can stack other things for individual use cases from there.
That's what I find most interesting about your clinical approach is like those things. Like I never would have thought of the autoimmune patient and microdosing this and adding that. It just seems like it's just so tailored to each person that they are going to maximize their journey.
Yeah. Yeah. And, because we're not dealing with pharmaceuticals, it is easier to play with these things, but pairing it up with the lifestyle, throwing low doses of things and then encouraging and coaching and inspiring and leading the patient to make these changes. I have 10 pillars of lasting weight loss, but I certainly don't need people to focus on 10 categories from the beginning. I mean, that's a lot. Let's focus on whatever you can focus on, which is why I have, for my warrior coaching, which is my most common one, before they get on a Zoom call with me, they go through this particular course that we created for that program, which really gives them I hate to say it because it's overwhelming for a lot of people to think of all this. It's the most tailored and pinpointed. Here's exactly what you need to know. And then we'll get on a Zoom call and then we'll customize it and tailor to you. Now that I'm talking to you and I can get to know you as an individual, yeah, I got your paperwork and your blood work, but let me talk to you because I got to see what's going on in here. And, because that's almost more powerful, I think, in many cases than the freaking, the objective stuff. What are you struggling with? What is your roadblock? What has worked for you in the past and what hasn't worked for you? What are you scared of? What, yada, yada, yada. And then we can kind of tailor it to that individual, really, really tailor it in. So
it's fascinating your approach on it because it is extremely overwhelming space, and there's so much noise out there. You can turn on YouTube or TikTok or IG or anything, and there's just so many different opinions. To have one person, to have your data, to have your blood work, to like here, let me overwhelm you with all the information first. It's too much, and then have somebody hold your hand, be like, okay, I know that was a lot. This is what we're going to do in this order to tailor it through, and you can globally grow a person. It's a phenomenal program.
Awesome. Yeah. I love it. I think we're doing something pretty cool, and I'm glad that I think word's starting to spread. And so this is just super cool to see this all unravel in front of us.
Another question I get quite often is it's kind of a different one. I haven't heard of. I've heard of it a lot, but it's more quieted. There's a libido aspect to some of the people that use GLP-1s, particularly in women's sexual health. They start taking these drugs, maybe because it affects the pleasure centers of your brain, but their libido just crashes. And for a lot of women, they would like to get that back. So are there specific targeted peptides to handle that type of issue as well?
Yeah. And we'll touch really quickly. I think this plays into also people reporting, women reporting changes in their menstrual cycle and changes in fertility. What a lot of people don't understand is that sex hormone production, testosterone, estrogen, and progesterone, are heavily influenced upstream by insulin or insulin resistance. And so when you have a drug like or peptide, by the way, whether you call GLP-1s a drug or a peptide is really, really interesting because technically they're a drug because they're made by these drug manufacturers. But then I thought they're a peptide, and Dr. Tina Moore calls them just slightly modified peptides. I call them kind of quasi in the middle peptide drugs because they're heavily modified. So let's be clear. They're not slightly modified. I mean, you're taking a peptide that only lasts a couple minutes in the body, and now you're making it last 7 days. That's a massive, let's not downplay that. Maybe it was a tiny little tweak molecularly, chemically speaking, but that's a massive change in the body. So I don't like to downplay that. But they're still not pure pharmaceutical drugs in the sense. So I just kind of wanted a caveat to that. Let me snap real quick. What can you repeat your question really quick?
Oh, I'm sorry. The women's libido, thinking of their type of peptides, women that have sexual dysfunction after starting a GLP-1 medication.
Perfect. Okay, cool. So the thing that I notice with women in particular is changes in their menstrual cycle, changes in things like fertility because this medication is improving insulin resistance. And so it has a downstream effect of changing sex hormone production, generally for the more positive. But you're mentioning something really interesting, which I've seen too as well, like a marked decrease in sexual production or sexual appetite, if you will. And if I had to gander and guess, I think this goes back to starvation mode. This is why competitive female bodybuilders talk about losing their menstrual cycle during this situation when they're literally damn near starving their body. So if I had to guess, I'm not positive. I think that is just simply a result of going into starvation mode and having your body say, okay, here's what I got to do. I got to crank down the metabolism. And so when I crank down the metabolism, other hormone productions are going to decrease too as well. Because I would argue for like what I was saying before that, if you go into the GLP-1 positively and not let starvation mode happen, you should have an increase in things potentially like your sexual appetite, because you should notice an improvement in hormone production, because that is well established that you can increase your testosterone levels simply by making positive lifestyle changes that then have an impact on insulin resistance. And so GLP-1s give you that almost instantaneous improvement in insulin resistance, which should have a downstream impact on increasing testosterone, which may or may not actually manifest, an increased sexual appetite, but definitely not downregulated. So I think that's, again, starvation mode, creating that scenario that you've seen.
And well, does your clinic, do you prescribe any peptides for that? What's the peptide that
Oh,
I'm trying to
yes,
think
yes.
of?
So getting into the peptides. So for someone struggling with a low sex drive, two pathways. Hormone therapy would be one, and looking at testosterone levels and seeing if that needs to be optimized, because testosterone plays a huge role in that. But if you're looking for a particular just kind of like situational improvement in that, PT141 comes to mind. So PT141, I call it the love peptide because it's really fascinating. PT141 works on these pathways called the melanocortin pathways, which from my understanding at this point, we don't have a huge understanding yet. It's a really interesting pathway that has effects on sexual appetite, erectile function for men. So literally this peptide in women will cause them to have, like, situationally there afterwards, improved sexual desire and appetite. And then for men, it gives massive improvements in erectile function. So that's really fascinating. Also, people have reported fat loss and appetite suppression too. So a lot of interesting things about PT141. We don't deal too much with sexual health. Every now and then patients come to us for those kind of peptides, but yeah, that one is really fascinating. And I love the name, the love peptide.
Moving to sleep. Sleep is arguably extremely important to muscle protein synthesis and hypertrophy and weight loss. Do you have peptides that you recommend to help your sleep quality? I know that you mentioned a couple of the ones that come to mind for me anyways before, but maybe another aspect of something else these peptides provide is the aspect of sleep.
Growth hormone peptides are the ones that come to mind. Some people just report massive improvements in their sleep. And when you look at growth hormone, like physiology and metabolism, for humans, at least healthy ones that don't have any sort of weird growth hormone issue, growth hormone is kind of released in pulses. And there's the biggest pulse of growth hormone when you slip into that first deep sleep cycle. So when you look at sleep architecture, there's this pattern that happens, usually kind of ranges around 90 minutes or so, where people are going into deeper stages till they get to the deepest stage, and then they go into this kind of weird, cool, dreaming REM sleep, and then they repeat that pattern every single 90 minutes ish. So although it does differ person to person, how long that cycle is. And so we know for growth hormone metabolism that the biggest pulse of growth hormone is when you get into that first deep sleep cycle. And so kind of makes sense that giving somebody more growth, and this is why most common recommendations are usually before bed. That is the best time to take your growth hormone peptide would be right before bed, 60, 90 minutes. Definitely wouldn't say that it gives like a drowsy effect and like it causes you to necessarily fall to sleep easier, although I have heard and seen reports of that. Just overall quality of sleep seems to improve from this. But there's another peptide that I'm not as versed in called deep sleep inducing peptide.
Gotcha.
So that's definitely a peptide that you'd probably want to go to a clinic that has more familiarity with it. But I do know of its existence. And I do know that peptide in particular can help people specifically if you have one of these devices like an Oura ring, for example, and you're really biohacking your health and you're trying to look at your structure of sleep. You can do these devices and see that maybe you're getting really good REM, but you're not getting as much deep. And so this peptide, what's people report, clinicians have reported that should strengthen that particular part, which is when your brain is pumping out these delta waves, which are these deeper waves. This peptide can go in there and enhance that. So our clinic has less familiarity with that one. But I do think that could be a particular tool if used by a provider that really understands that aspect of it. I haven't had too many situations where we couldn't improve someone's sleep through the combination of growth hormone peptides, but again, lifestyle. literally there's these really powerful supplements that, and we can go on and on about which ones, but then also there's a lot of sleep lifestyle strategies. Literally, I'll just say the most important one because it's kind of, you wouldn't guess, but out of all the different things you can do to improve sleep quality, the number one thing to do, and this is based off the most recent research, is sleeping on a schedule. Literally taking yourselves back to when you were a child and we had a bedtime and we had a wake time. Adhering to a bedtime 7 days a week is the most powerful thing you can do to improve sleep quality, which is interesting, right? That would not be the first thing that I would guess. And where most people, as you can imagine, struggle is the weekends and, time when you're not working. And, you kind of really have to change your frame of thought. Like, am I losing out on evening time? Well, you're also going to wake up way earlier too, right? So it's fascinating. But yeah, doing that will really strengthen and anchor your circadian rhythm. And that impact on strengthening the circadian rhythm, which is this internal biological clock, then allows your body to prepare for sleep better and get the quality that it needs. Because it's a whole process every night when your body's trying to go to sleep. It's pumping out melatonin and it's decreasing the production of other hormones. And this whole myriad of hormones are some are increasing, some are decreasing. And a lot of that's sort of orchestrated by various glands that are then governed by this biological clock that we call the circadian rhythm. So it's super interesting that alone can have such a powerful effect. But yeah, those are the peptides that come to mind for improving sleep quality.
You mentioned that they were the growth hormone peptides, but could you just list, because it's a lot, the familiarity is different for people. Can you just list off quickly which ones those are? Which ones are those growth hormone peptides?
Yes. So Semaglutide, Tesamorelin, and then technically CJC 1295 on its own would cause some growth hormone release. Ipamorelin on its own would cause some growth hormone release. But again, you'll always see those two most of the time compounded together because they have a synergistic effect.
Thank you very much. Well, I can't think of any. Those are all the questions that I have on my list. Did you have anything that you wanted to add to this vast world of peptides?
I that's all I got for today. We are at exactly 1 hour. I know, right? Time flew by today. I'm super excited for more episodes with you. You might want to ask your audience, what do they want to hear too?
You can ask them.
Yeah. You guys let us know here what you guys want to see us talk. If you tell us to choose, I'll choose my favorite ones to talk about, which will be reversing insulin resistance and fasting and yada, yada, yada. But if you guys want to see any particular topics, let us know. For any of you that want to reach out to us and work with us, we're doing a special deal for any of you followers of Candace. Right now, until she gets a custom link to give you guys from us, just mention her name. She's the only Candace I know that's referring people to us. So if you mention Candace, what is it? Candace T on GLP. What does that mean, by the way? What does the T on GLP-1 mean?
It's like you got the T, you got the information. But
cool.
The one at the end was too much. So it's just GLP, not GLP-1.
Okay. So yeah, if you mention her, shoot us a text message and I'm sure we'll put it on the screen for you guys here on this podcast, but 229-441-3562. That's 229-441-3562. Just mention Candace. You guys will get the special discount. We have all the various peptides that we talked about, that we prescribe, the GLP-1s, we prescribe all 50 states. And then most importantly, I hope you guys see the value in the coaching and the structure. That's what I think is what I'm seeing in the last couple months here is more and more people are already on the GLP-1s and you guys are finding me. And, so if you already have the GLP-1s, freaking great. If you can get it covered by your insurance, although that's really challenging. If you are lucky enough to have an insurance company that's actually playing with you, phenomenal. Just come to us for the coaching, possibly get some AOD stacked into it. Or if you're looking to start everything together and you want to do it right, we'll take good care of you.
Well, thank you very much. Oh, and if you have any questions for Dr. Jones, we'll pick out some of the ones and answer them on our next episode.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.